Princess Anne never had to shout. She simply stood before a handful of senior royal officials, rested her palm against the polished surface of the table, and delivered a change in protocol that would quietly bury whatever royal ambitions Meghan still held. The wording was exact, the measure was permanent, and it was already in force. From that moment forward, Meghan would be shut out of every future official royal event, no matter who requested her presence, no matter how the family pleaded, and no matter how the public mood shifted. Before we go any further into what this really means for the House of Windsor, take a second to subscribe so nothing slips past you. Anne held the room frozen, with a stillness that felt heavier than any raised voice. Palace protocol is the framework that dictates royal access, appearances, and ceremonial standing, and this particular ruling reached far beyond any short-term ban. It stripped Meghan out of state ceremonies, palace receptions, commemorations, balcony moments, and every family gathering held under the authority of the crown. Her name would never even reach the king for consideration. It would be crossed out long before the invitation list ever landed on his desk. The Princess Royal stayed composed, but composure did not equal ease. One courtier noticed how her fingers pressed harder against the wood as she explained that the directive had already been signed off and threaded into palace planning software. 3 upcoming events had quietly been run through the new filter, and Meghan's name had been rejected on every one. Anne knew what this meant. The blow would land on Harry just as hard as on his wife, because each closed door would read to him like a verdict on his own standing inside the family he was born into. Word reached Meghan in California through an official palace communication. She froze midway across the room, read the closing line a second time, and asked whether memorial services and major family occasions were included in the ban. The answer that came back had no cushion: yes. Her face shifted, though not into fury. It shifted into disbelief. Resistance she had prepared for. Permanence she had not. Charles could not simply wave it away. The monarch could still extend a personal invitation, but this protocol demanded a formal reversal, signed by several of the most senior royal authorities, before any exception could be granted. That single detail slammed the door on any last-minute rescue driven by guilt, sentiment, or family pressure. The system had been engineered to withstand the very hesitation of the man who might one day want to unwind it. The officials filed out without speaking. Anne remained behind, her gaze fixed on a single unopened envelope written in Harry's unmistakable hand. She understood that the palace had sealed its gates through procedure, but that envelope carried something sharper. It was proof that the family had been told this reckoning was coming, and that the next fight would not be over Meghan's access alone. It would be over loyalty, over blood, and over who would be forced to pick a side. On paper, in dry palace language, the decision looked straightforward. To Princess Anne, it was anything but. Harry was not some inconvenient name floating around a guest list. He was her nephew, the boy she had watched grow up carrying the weight of royal expectation on shoulders that were once far too small. Meghan now stood outside the institution, yet her absence would ripple through everyone still inside it. And Charles was staring down a decision no father could face without pain. Anne had built her entire life around duty, discipline, and shielding the crown from emotional turbulence. When she spoke of the crown, she meant the public institution of the monarchy, not just the individual wearing it, and she believed the rules of that institution existed precisely to stop private wounds from dictating national responsibility. To her mind, protocol was not vengeance. It was a boundary line that stopped personal grievance from deciding who walked through the doors, who spoke in the family's name, and who represented the royal house to the world. Meghan, on the other hand, still viewed major ceremonies as a potential path back into royal visibility. She no longer performed official duties, but memorials, anniversaries, and events involving the children could still place her shoulder to shoulder with the family in front of the global press. The permanent restriction incinerated that possibility. It removed the last flicker of ambiguity she had been quietly holding on to, and it made brutally clear that personal ties no longer bought public access. Harry heard the news through a private phone call before the story leaked past palace walls. He listened without interrupting, walked slowly toward a window, and asked whether Anne herself had driven the decision through. His tone stayed even, but the question dripped with a sense of betrayal. He had braced for pushback from officials. He had not braced for his own aunt to become the face of the final wall. Charles read the summary alone. The king slid his glasses off, laid them beside the paper, and sat in silence. As sovereign, he could see why the restriction would bring order. As a father, he could only watch another wall rising between himself and his younger son. He knew perfectly well that Harry would never neatly separate the institution from the family, even though the palace insisted the two were entirely different things. Anne had actually tried to steer this away from the sharpest ending. She had floated a compromise, allowing Meghan into private family gatherings while keeping her clear of official royal events. Advisors threw the idea out. Under relentless media scrutiny, private and public could never truly be held apart. A single photograph, a disputed seat, an unexpected arrival, and the entire dispute would explode all over again. Meghan had genuinely believed Charles would carve out some route back, especially around major family milestones. The new protocol proved she had been mistaken. Blood, marriage, and personal sympathy no longer controlled the official gates. At last, Anne opened Harry's letter. There was no apology inside. Instead, there was a warning. If Meghan were permanently excluded, he would seriously reconsider ever attending future royal events himself. Harry's threat made the fallout painfully personal. But an earlier ceremony and one defiant conversation had already convinced Anne that temporary fixes could no longer hold the palace together. Every permanent royal order starts with the moment the palace first tries to contain quietly. This one began during the planning stages of the Commonwealth Remembrance Reception, when Meghan's representatives requested access to the ceremony, a prominent arrival slot, and formal acknowledgement inside the official program. The request itself was not what tipped the balance. What happened during a private telephone call afterward did. By the time that call was over, Princess Anne understood that informal boundaries had collapsed, and something permanent would have to replace them. For months, Anne had watched palace planners deal with Meghan's possible attendance on a case-by-case basis. The Commonwealth Remembrance Reception was a formal gathering honoring the nations and shared service of the Commonwealth, and every choice made around it carried public significance. Every fresh request forced officials back into old arguments over security, seating, titles, photographs, arrival times, and whether Meghan would be treated as a private relative or a former working royal. Nothing ever stayed decided. Anne could feel the authority of the palace eroding a little with each concession. The Princess Royal was convinced that ceremonies could not keep being redesigned around someone who no longer represented the crown, meaning the public institution and duties of the monarchy. Meghan read those same arrangements through a completely different lens. She was convinced that being placed among private relatives instead of senior royals would make her look deliberately downgraded in front of the entire world. Meghan spoke to Anne directly during the private call, with no aides cutting in and no drafted statement to soften what either of them might say. She argued that turning up without visible recognition would be more humiliating than being kept away entirely. The Duchess insisted her marriage, her history, and her bond with Harry could not simply be tucked behind a seating chart. Anne answered with measured firmness. Royal position, she said, followed service, not marriage on its own, and public status could not remain untouched once official duties had ended. Meghan accused the palace of rewriting the rulebook specifically to erase her. The Princess Royal rejected the accusation flatly, but by then the exchange had turned cold, personal, and beyond repair. Meghan then declared she would not attend under those conditions, and warned that the palace would carry the blame for whatever public fallout followed her exclusion. Anne ended the call, placed the receiver back down, and told her waiting private secretary, "We cannot renegotiate the monarchy at every doorway." Hours later, Meghan's team pushed back with an amended proposal. It called for a separate arrival, entry through the principal entrance, and independent media coverage. Anne read it through twice. The revised terms only confirmed for her that the argument was no longer about family reconciliation at all. It was about royal visibility. That evening, she summoned 2 constitutional advisors and ordered them to draft a protocol tough enough to survive personal appeals, press storms, and even the hesitation of Charles himself. Frustration had officially hardened into policy. But Meghan was not going to accept a permanent verdict without confronting the woman who had made it possible. There were no cameras, no aides, and no polished statements when Meghan finally faced Anne head-on. The conversation happened over a secure video link, but the ocean between California and London did nothing to dull it. Meghan wanted to know why every possible route back had been sealed. Anne wanted her to accept that the question had already been answered. What followed was not a negotiation. It was the final collapse of whatever trust remained. Meghan had refused to communicate through private secretaries any longer. Those officials handled scheduling and correspondence for senior royals. But Meghan believed their presence only masked the truth beneath layers of polite palace language. She demanded a direct exchange. Anne agreed, though the Princess Royal spelled out one thing before the call even began. The restriction was already active, and this conversation would not reverse it. Anne set out the boundary without flinching. Meghan could still attend gatherings hosted by charities, corporations, or private organizations if they invited her as an ordinary guest. She could not appear at ceremonies organized, funded, hosted, or formally supported by the royal household, the system that runs official royal duties and events. The distinction mattered because one type of appearance belonged to a private life. The other carried the weight of the crown. Meghan accused Anne of dressing up a personal attack in neutral vocabulary. She said the protocol had been drafted around a single woman while pretending to safeguard an entire institution. No other married relative, she pointed out, had ever been pushed behind such a total and lasting barrier. Her voice stayed controlled, but the anger sharpened every syllable. Anne refused to give ground. No other family member, she replied, had tried to hang on to ceremonial status after walking away from the duties that made it possible. Marriage could tie you to a family, she said, but it could not lock in an official role forever. Meghan's face hardened. She heard no explanation, only a verdict. Meghan leaned closer and asked the question neither of them could soften. Would the palace still block her if Harry walked beside her through the entrance? Anne paused. Then she looked straight into the camera and answered, yes. Silence flooded the call. Meghan slowly closed the notebook resting in front of her. The gesture carried more force than any shouted reply because it showed she finally accepted the decision was real. Meghan then floated the theory that Charles had been pressured into approving it. Anne, still on the recorded line, revealed that the king had been offered several temporary alternatives and had turned each one down because every option simply teed up the same conflict to return. Minutes after the call ended, Harry reached out to his father, demanding an explanation. Charles agreed to talk, but only if Anne remained waiting in the adjoining room. Meghan had heard the final word from Anne, yet the deeper reckoning now belonged to the father, forced to justify that ruling to his own son. Princess Anne had unveiled the protocol, but she had not built its authority on her own. Its power came from a reluctant king, a future monarch determined to defend the institution, and a royal system worn thin by uncertainty. When Charles signed the final approval, there was nothing triumphant in his face. He looked defeated. Yet his signature stayed on the page because the crown had finally chosen consistency over the fragile hope of reconciliation. Charles carried the final responsibility. The protocol only became binding palace procedure after the king approved recommendations from Anne, William, senior household officials, and security planners. Binding procedure meant a rule staff had to follow, not a suggestion they could quietly ignore. His name transformed a delicate proposal into an order that would shape every future guest list, entrance plan, and ceremonial invitation. William backed the restriction with a colder conviction. The Prince of Wales was adamant that royal events could no longer be dragged into repeated skirmishes over Meghan's seating, status, protection, and press access. Every dispute pulled attention away from the purpose of the ceremony itself and made the monarchy look incapable of managing its own household. He understood the cost with painful clarity. A single, uncertain invitation could hijack an event meant to serve the nation. Charles still searched for a way out. Before signing, the monarch asked whether the restriction could be given a 5-year expiry. Anne answered that an expiry date would not deliver peace. It would only start a countdown, encouraging another campaign, another argument, and another showdown the moment the deadline arrived. The king lowered his pen. He hesitated long enough for everyone in the room to feel the pain sitting behind the silence. Then he finished writing his name and accepted the blame before anyone had the chance to place it on him. She told Charles that Harry would likely aim his anger at her rather than at the wider system. The Princess Royal was ready to absorb that resentment if it kept the king from being publicly ripped between his duty as sovereign and his love as a father. Her willingness gave him shelter, but it also planted her squarely in the path of the family's fury. William insisted on one final safeguard. He demanded the rule apply even if Meghan arrived beside Harry, and even if she received a private verbal invitation. Without equal enforcement, the future king feared every major event would end in chaos at the palace gates. The reversal process reinforced the boundary further. Any change would require a written agreement from the sovereign, the heir, the Lord Chamberlain, the senior official who oversees major royal ceremonies, and the royal responsible for ceremonial standards. No whispered promise could dismantle it. Then palace planners identified the first test. Harry and Meghan were expected at an upcoming national service. The signatures had been secured behind closed doors. But policy only becomes real when someone reaches for a door and finds it will no longer open. For several days, Meghan waited for an invitation that palace officials had already privately decided would never leave the building. The national service had once represented a possible route back, a solemn moment when family presence might outweigh institutional hostility. Instead, the silence became the message. When the confirmed guest list reached California without her name on it, Meghan did not erupt immediately. She simply stared at the page as the permanence of Anne's ruling finally sank in. The National Service of Unity would be the first major royal occasion staged under the new protocol. The ceremony was designed to bring the country and the royal family together during a moment of national reflection, which made her exclusion cut all the deeper. Harry remained eligible as the king's son. Meghan was automatically stripped out before the final invitations were even prepared. This was no longer a warning shot. The rule was being enforced. Palace officials moved fast. They dismantled the contingency seating plan that had once held space for the couple, canceled the separate arrival route, withdrew the additional security request, and shut down the media area prepared in case Meghan was ever approved. Each change mattered, because each showed the palace was no longer preparing for negotiation. In one stroke, Anne's decision had rewired the machinery of the event before anyone could lodge an appeal. Meghan turned to Harry and asked whether he still planned to attend without her. She tried to sound steady, but her voice pulled tight when she said the palace was forcing him to choose in full view of the world. To her, his attendance would look like tacit acceptance of the ban. His absence would prove loyalty, but it could also deepen the fracture with Charles. Harry folded the printed guest list and laid it face down. He said he had not decided yet. That silence stung Meghan more than an outright refusal, because it suggested part of him still ached to stand inside the royal world. She watched him closely as he avoided giving her the promise she wanted. Then a private invitation arrived through a secure palace channel. Harry had been invited separately, making it clear that the king still recognized him as a son, even though his wife no longer had a place at official royal occasions. Clipped to it was a handwritten note from Anne. "The door to family," it read, "is not the same as the door to duty." Harry read the line twice. The distinction infuriated him, yet it also revealed that his aunt had not entirely turned her back on him. Instead of refusing the invitation, he contacted Anne and asked to meet her alone in Britain before making up his mind. Meghan was certain the separate invitation had been engineered to divide them, but Harry's quiet request for a private meeting would tilt the conflict in a direction neither woman had seen coming. When Harry stepped into the private sitting room, Princess Anne dismissed the last aide and pulled the door shut herself. There were no officials to hide behind, and no protocol language left to soften the truth. He stood before the aunt he once trusted and demanded to know why she had made his wife permanently unwelcome. Anne did not fire back straight away. She offered him a seat, waited until he declined, and then told him the decision had never been about revenge. Harry had traveled to Britain alone. Meghan remained in California, unsure whether the meeting represented a chance at reconciliation or a request for surrender. The royal residence had been chosen because it sat away from formal palace business, and that mattered, because neither side could later blame advisors, public pressure, or drafted statements for what would be said between them now. Harry demanded a clean answer. He wanted to know whether there was any genuine difference between protecting the monarchy and punishing Meghan. Anne agreed to explain without notes and without officials. The monarchy, she said, was the public institution built around royal duty. The family was personal and private. Blurring those two worlds, she warned, had produced years of repeated conflict. Harry refused to swallow the distinction easily. He told Anne that every exclusion carried a message to his children. Each closed door whispered to them that their mother was being treated as a permanent threat to the family they had been born into. His anger trembled, not from any loss of control, but because the wound reached beyond Meghan and stretched into the future of his own children. Anne finally let her own sadness show. She admitted she still remembered Meghan's early promise and had once believed she could grow into a powerful royal figure. Her disappointment, she told him, was not that Meghan had chosen to leave. It was that every attempt at return had collapsed into another argument over titles, entrances, status, and public recognition. Anne turned a framed family photograph toward Harry. She pointed at the place where they had all once stood together and told him that family memories could not govern state ceremonies. State ceremonies are official national events staged in the name of the crown, not private reunions. Harry looked down. For the first time, his anger gave way to grief. Then Anne offered a single protected path. Meghan would remain barred from official royal events, but private family meetings could still happen without cameras, titles, ceremonial positioning, or palace branding. The relationship had been restricted, she told him, but it had not been erased. Harry made his choice. He would decline the National Service of Unity, but he would not attack the protocol publicly, and he would not let his absence be turned into another battle. Harry could not force the ceremonial door back open for Meghan, but by refusing to launch a public war, he changed the way the world would eventually judge the palace's harshest boundary. By sunrise, the secret protocol was no longer a secret. Britain woke up to a front page dominated by a photograph of Princess Anne under 5 enormous words. The royal door is closed. Broadcasters cut into scheduled programs, crowds gathered near Buckingham Palace, and commentators clashed over whether the decision represented strength or cruelty. Yet the most powerful public image was not Meghan's anger or Anne's authority. It was Harry's silence as the country began choosing sides. Palace communications confirmed the change through a formal public statement. That office handles official messages issued in the name of the royal household, and its wording carried permanent weight. Attendance at future royal events, it said, would depend on active constitutional duty, recognized household status, and approved ceremonial responsibility. In plain terms, family connection alone would no longer buy you a seat at occasions representing the crown. Officials steered clear of direct personal attacks. The statement did not hammer Meghan's name, question her motives, or drag old accusations back into the open. Instead, it framed the protocol as a lasting clarification designed to protect consistency across future reigns. That restraint was deliberate, because the palace wanted to appear larger than one dispute. The rule was presented as something that would outlast Charles, guide William, and stop private negotiations from ever hijacking public ceremonies again. Britain split almost immediately. Some viewers praised Anne for ending years of drift and shielding events from constant flare-ups. Others accused the monarchy of humiliating a woman who had already walked away from royal service. Within hours, the debate was no longer only about access. It had morphed into an argument over whether duty demanded firm limits, or whether families should always keep at least one door propped open. Meghan watched the coverage beside a muted television. She saw palace gates behind commentators and heard the decision described again and again as final. The Duchess put out no immediate response. Her silence came partly from shock and partly from calculation. A furious statement would only strengthen the palace's argument that every future appearance was destined to trigger another public row. Outside Buckingham Palace, the divide became impossible to ignore. Near the Victoria Memorial, one supporter held a handmade sign reading, "Duty has boundaries." Across the barrier, another raised the answer, "Family should not." Those two lines captured the entire national split more precisely than hours of televised debate ever could. Harry then stopped the story from detonating. A strongly worded response had been prepared, accusing the palace of institutional exclusion, meaning a system using its own rules to shut a single person out. He asked that it never be released, honoring the private understanding he had reached with Anne. As the criticism climbed, the Princess Royal agreed to address senior household staff one final time. She would not defend her reputation. She would explain what the monarchy would have to become in the aftermath of the conflict. The country had already delivered competing verdicts, but the true meaning of the decision would come from the woman who had accepted responsibility for closing the door. Princess Anne stood in front of the royal household, knowing history might remember her as the woman who permanently barred Meghan from official royal life. She did not ask for praise, and she did not shrink from the pain the decision had caused. Instead, she delivered one last explanation. The monarchy, she said, could not survive if ceremonial access became a bargaining chip in personal disputes. A boundary had been drawn, not to erase a family member, but to separate private blood from public duty. Anne spoke with quiet certainty. The royal household, the staff and offices responsible for supporting the monarch and organizing official duties, understood this was no temporary measure. Meghan would remain excluded from future royal events unless the entire protocol was formally reversed by Charles, William, and senior ceremonial authorities. No whispered promise, emotional appeal, or last-minute invitation would ever quietly undo it. The Princess Royal drew another line clearly. The order did not brand Meghan an enemy, dissolve her marriage, or ban private contact with the family. It simply confirmed that a personal connection to the royals did not automatically hand over access to the public work of the crown. That distinction mattered because it protected family relationships without letting them dictate matters of state. Anne accepted the burden without flinching. Leadership, she told the staff, sometimes meant becoming the face of a decision others quietly believed had to be made. She knew Harry might blame her, Meghan might resent her, and the public might judge her without mercy. Even so, she refused to shelter behind Charles, William, or a group of unnamed officials. Meghan received the final palace message in California. She read it slowly, closed it, and slid it into a drawer without drafting a reply. The Duchess understood that another interview, statement, or public battle would not reopen the royal chapter she had hoped to reclaim. For the first time, finality had replaced resistance. Harry chose a quieter road. He declined the National Service of Unity, but sent Charles a private message expressing love and explaining that he would not attend without Meghan. The Duke refused to abandon his wife, but he also refused to shatter what still remained between himself and his father. Charles read the message alone. The king asked that it be preserved among his private correspondence, meaning personal letters kept outside official government records. He could not stitch the division back together, but he could see that the conflict had at last stopped growing. Anne's protocol did not reunite the family. It did something colder and necessary. It created certainty. Meghan's official royal future was finished. Harry's private connection remained possible. And the monarchy moved forward with a boundary that no pressure could quietly rub away. The palace gates did not shut in anger. They shut with the heavy certainty that duty and family could no longer share the same space. And by accepting that painful truth, Anne finally ended the struggle that had trapped every one of them. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.